Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Rooney. I am a research fellow at Policy Exchange in the Energy and Environment Unit, and I'll be chairing this event on small modular nuclear reactors, which we have slightly provocatively titled A Nuclear Reactor in Every Town. So on our panel, we have Tom Greatrex, Chief Executive of the Nuclear Industry Association, David Orr, Senior Vice President from Rolls-Royce Nuclear, and Dr. Sarah Meehan from the Campaign for Science and Engineering. Before I give the panelists their 5-minute introductory statements, and then we'll open out to the floor, I'll just go over some housekeeping issues and give an introduction to the topic. First of all, I'd like to thank Rolls-Royce for sponsoring this event and let you know that on some of your seats and at the back, you will have their leaflet on their plan to build a British small modular reactor. I'd also like to thank the Conservative Party for hosting us and our events team for this crazy 2 days of events, well, 3 or 4 days of events that they have to run. Just to let you know that the event is being live streamed on various websites, and so when you ask a question, it will be live streamed and it will be put up on the Policy Exchange website after the event. So when I first applied to work at Policy Exchange about a year ago, they asked me to come up with a research proposal as part of the application process, and I made a proposal for a piece of research on small modular nuclear reactors. And partially this was because it was very timely with shortly after George Osborne announcing $250 million for nuclear research, within which would be money to run a competition to find a British small modular reactor. And also because I was doing a PhD at the time and part of my topic was small modular reactors, so I was saving energy by doing something I knew a little bit about. So when people ask me why I'm still open to the idea of new nuclear power, I sort of say, well, I quote one of my heroes, which is Sir David Mackay, ex-chief scientist at DEC, who said, "I'm not pro-nuclear, I'm pro-arithmetic." I look at the 100% renewable energy plans very, very closely, and I've yet to see one that is really credible at all. So can nuclear play a role? It's fair to say that large nuclear reactors are not doing so well in the Western world. Hinkley Point C is an ongoing saga. Westinghouse have had trouble in North America. Hitachi had trouble. So it's fair to say it's very difficult in liberalized economies to fund large nuclear reactor projects these days. And that's where small modular reactors could come in. And so the problem with large reactors is not due just to nuclear power. It's a fundamental problem with all large infrastructure projects, is that they have a tendency to go over budget. And the National Audit Office of the UK actually produced a book on optimism bias on large infrastructure projects. So all one-off large, big projects have this susceptibility to overrun on costs. And partially this is because you have to build everything on site, and every site has different challenges, different weather, different land. And so small modular reactors, the important word is modular rather than small, because this small encompasses a large range from very small reactors at 4 megawatt to, I think Rolls-Royce's design is 440 megawatt, which could power a rather large city. But the important thing is modular. You build it in a factory, you standardize it, you replicate the design, and hopefully you get the learning by doing and economies of volume, which will bring down costs over time. It's fair to say we've got a fairly pro-nuclear panel. We're going to have our opening statements from them, but I hope the questions will bring up some of the issues on deployment of small modular reactors, because lots of uncertainties around how fast can we build them, which design should we choose, do we stick with the 3rd generation, or maybe we could, when I hold events on nuclear power, everyone talks about thorium or molten salt reactors and all of these exciting designs, but they might not be the way to bring down costs quickly, so what is the balance there? And I'd like to start with David Orr from Rolls-Royce, and as a company looking to deploy small modular reactors, what is your view on the future?
Thank you, Matt. What I was going to say first of all was just give my view on what the future generation forecasts are for the UK and the kind of energy mix, because we're not against any types of energy at all. We see this as being a balanced energy economy for the future for the UK, and must be that. When we look at, we've looked at about 14 forecasts in total that are around from different institutions and universities, etc. The one that we tend to look at is the clockwork one, which is from the Engineer Technologies Institute. And what that shows with the decarbonisation targets and the economics, that it's roughly a third between the three, between renewables, between nuclear, and between gas with carbon capture systems. So those are the type of ratios that we're looking at. If we actually look by 2050 of the forecast of requirements, because it's not just transport, rail and car that are going to increase in terms of what's required for electrification, but also heat and industrial intakes got to be done as well to meet those targets particularly. So the actual level of nuclear at that type is around about the 40 gigawatt electric. Now, to put that into context, the Large Generation 3 programme, which is currently announced and the first one underway, is around about 16 gigawatts. So our view is that there is a clear space for small modular reactors within the energy mix forecast going forward. And our belief is that we can also do these economically. The way we've done our design for this station, and I must say it's for a station, not just for a nuclear reactor, if you look at the actual capital cost breakdown of a plant, a reactor station, then only around 25 to 30% of that is the reactor itself. The balance of plant and the civil construction, back to Matt's point about major infrastructure programs, absolutely right. Those are the drivers. We've done this very much from a business case perspective, market driven, and we've looked at the risk drivers for the program, and one of the key ones is to reduce the time on site during the construction phase. In order to do that, Matt's pinched a lot of my lines, is that what we want to do is to transport as much as possible into a factory environment, get a learner curve, and actually improve the time frame by spending a lot less effort and time on site. And in that purpose, we'd be likely to have, we're forecasting to have 3 factories in the UK for a fleet. That would be one for the primary vessels and the primary components. There'd be one for the mechanical electrical modules and the pass off of those. And very important as well, one for civil engineering, civil construction modules as well. So we have consortium partners who cover the entire stream of the reactor power station who are working with us in the development. In order to do this, it's not going to be a nuclear reactor in every town. It is rather a pokey title. We actually have assessed as well that there are enough nuclear licensed sites existing in the UK to be able to deploy a fleet to give return on investment for the investors in this programme without having to go on to new sites. So there is enough out there. There's certainly enough public acceptance within the sites for first of a kind and next of a kind. So there are sites that we've identified. We've done site-specific surveys of those, and we've had discussions with local politicians and councillors, and they're in train at the moment on those as well for that. Hugely important on public acceptance. On regulation, the government has now given the regulator a 2-year contract to actually look at tailoring the licensing process for small modular reactors, and we've had our first formal meeting for that. We've also, ourselves and other competitors within the expression of interest, post the George Osborne competition announcement last year, have been engaged again now with government recently in the last couple of months, and it is believed that that process is going to come to an end within the next 2 to 4 weeks, and the government will select the way forward and a roadmap for how they're going to hopefully place SMRs in the future energy policy, and also what they're going to do about the selection process. Our design actually draws as well on our Rolls-Royce's university technology network, very much so. We have 14 universities working with us on this. We have the Catapult programs, the Nuclear Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, the National Nuclear Laboratory, are all working with us on this programme. We also are looking at forecasting for this fleet 15,000 sustainable, highly skilled jobs in the UK, and at the top of the commitment with the UK programme and exports, because the other thing is, with it being a national programme, we will be developing our own intellectual property, which we know is absolutely vital to be able to retain long-term, highly skilled jobs in the UK. So that's hugely important. So those are the kind of magnums of jobs that we're talking about. In terms of economics, a reactor station, you won't expect me to do anything else other than give ranges at the moment. I did this at the Westminster Energy Forum recently, but we're actually talking in the order of a capital cost of between about 1.6 and £2 billion for a station. And again, a lot of when we're talking about large reactor prices, a lot of the cost goes into the financing cost of the reactor. You can't get away from the weighted average cost of capital and what that means to a strike price. So actually, these are very much more affordable, both for the domestic market and for export internationally. So it's not just a way of securing our energy future in the environment we find ourselves in the world at the moment. It's a way to create and retain great skills. And actually, it's probably our last in a generation opportunity to be able to do this. I say that with some confidence. Rolls-Royce has been involved in nuclear for over 60 years in the UK, and we're probably the only one in the UK that's an existing nuclear steam raising plant designer and supply chain manager in the UK. So it's from a position of that strength that I say that. It isn't that we're against Generation 4 at all. It's just that our personal view is that that will not come in a timely manner in order to be deployed in the timescales that are required by our energy mix. When we're looking at the overall mix, probably between half and 2/3 of our current generation capacity will be retired by 2030. So there's a significant gap in order to get that generation going. So we absolutely have to be looking at meeting 2030 on the grid timeframes for this technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. A couple of points of clarification. For those who aren't familiar with the nuclear industry, we refer to nuclear reactor designs in generations. Generation 1, Generation 2, and most of the reactors online now are pressurized water reactors, Generation 3. And some of the designs we refer to now are Generation 3+, so it'll be pressurized water reactors with advanced safety features and proliferation resistance. And then the future reactors are referred to as Generation 4, which are advanced designs, which will be 20, 30, 40 years away, which haven't really been deployed at scale yet. One thing I just forgot to mention in the opening statement is we had Trudy Harrison on the panel for a while this morning, but unfortunately she had a flood in her constituency and had to go back immediately. I'd like to now go to Tom Greatrex from Nuclear Industry Associations, who can perhaps give us a higher level of the policy implications of new nuclear power and small modular reactors.
Sure, thanks very much, Matt. I think first thing I would say was I wouldn't necessarily agree with your introductory remarks around large-scale nuclear. You would expect me to say that, I think, but it's a fact that is often missed that at Hinkley at the moment, if you were there today, there'll be more than 2,000 people, around 2,000 people on site. That is a construction site building that first new reactor for a generation. And it's a very timely thing that that's happening now, because in the wider context, as both you and David referred to, with between 2010 and 2030, 2/3 of our dispatchable generation capacity will have reached the end of its lives. And that's including all of our current nuclear fleet, with the exception of one. So that 2030 timeframe is pressing. And to meet that wider energy challenge and electricity challenge that we talk about, you look at the overall demand for electricity, the likely demand for electricity in the UK, and the national grid scenarios from the summer. I think were quite useful and instructive in this, particularly as the acceleration of moves towards more electrification of transport, for example, and then in time with heating as well. Presents a UK issue, but also, as David said, with SMR, the potential opportunities, export opportunities, you want to think about the electricity demand is likely to be more widely across the world as well, because the demand for power is only going to increase. Other technological developments will present different ways of being able to produce and store and use power. But overall, the distinction between energy and electricity is diminishing. That presents us globally and in the UK with both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge is to be able to provide that reliable, secure, available power, electricity and power supply that people are going to need to power their homes and businesses, public services, and increasingly their transport needs as well. And some challenges around how we best do that. Now, what I think the potential benefit of small modular reactors, and there are a range of different technologies or groups that have entered into the government's competition that David referred to. So I'm speaking on behalf of this in relation to SMRs generally, is there some complementary features that are well placed within that mix, including with larger scale nuclear as well, particularly around the point about, and I'm not sure whether it's so much affordability as financeability. When you have something which you can potentially construction costs which are significantly lower because partly they're smaller, but also with the ability to be able to use infrastructure on sites that are around nuclear license sites, existing nuclear license sites that aren't identified for larger scale reactor developments, gives you an opportunity to start with. Features around flexibility, which are also potentially important because of the different nature of the larger amount of intermittency we're going to have amongst our electricity mix, as we already are starting to have and will continue to have into the future. The best ways of being able to balance that up. The opportunities to really foster innovation. Some of the work that the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre near Sheffield is doing on nuclear, but that general advanced manufacturing research that's happening, being able to apply that and being able to develop the UK IP to be able to do that is something which is there's a huge amount of potential with SMRs as part of that mix, and of course the exportability, which I think is vitally important when we're thinking more widely and in the context of this conference and some of the things that have already been said and I'm sure will be said over the weeks ahead in terms of industrial strategy and the rebalancing the economy or sharing the growth abilities from around different parts of the country, that both the SMR technology but also the supply chain, and particularly around the modularisation that again David referred to. When you look at some of the areas where in other sectors that modular capability has been really finely developed and honed over recent years, and I'm thinking particularly of some of the shipyards, for example, and Camel Laird as an example of amongst others of that. All of those things bring together, I think, a really exciting opportunity for the UK to be able to grasp that will not only contribute to our wider energy and electricity needs, but also provide some impetus for real, sustainable, long-term and exportable growth and economic opportunity and jobs, which is obviously an important part of the wider context politically that we're in. And if you're able to marry up the need for that secure and reliable supply of power with an industrial and exportable economic opportunity, then it's something that I think is something the government should be considering very hard. And the good news is they are. Obviously, you refer to the competition. That has been going on perhaps longer than people were anticipating, certainly longer than the government had initially indicated. But as David said, the signs are that is coming towards its conclusion. We have the potential through industrial strategy of a sector deal and sector deals, and it may well be that this is a good way of being able to, for the government to demonstrate its commitment on what it can do, while the industry and through work that Rolls-Royce and others have done and pulling together different consortiums and groupings to be able to demonstrate the appetite and ability and aptitude there is to take these technologies forward. That a combination of those two things can give us something that I think we're very much in need of in this country, which is a real industrial opportunity that helps us to bridge that and meet that energy and electricity requirement we have for the future.
Thank you, Tom. With regard to your point on large reactors, there have been, so I studied this briefly, and there have been periods around the world of reactor programs of bringing down costs of large reactors, but it's usually when there's a state champion building one reactor design and churning them out. And even now, nuclear power isn't struggling so much in China and Russia, where they're churning out 100 gigawatt of nuclear in the next few decades in China. And I think Russia have just agreed to build a very cheap reactor in Romania, which got past the EU state aid laws. But what strikes me is the UK's current strategy, we need to meet our decarbonisation targets, and to do that without nuclear power is very difficult. So they're bringing in people, inviting them to build nuclear reactors around the country, which is a very good strategy to get lots of low carbon electricity onto the grid very quickly, but it's not a good strategy to bring down costs so much. And I have sympathy for the government because they have to decarbonise quite quickly, but we don't have a national British champion to build our nuclear reactors. So maybe go broader to the larger science and engineering environment. I'm delighted to have the campaign for science and engineering represented, because I used to be a mechanical engineer in my previous life, and I was a STEM ambassador going out to schools and promoting science and engineering. You'd like to give us your 5 minutes?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you. You described the panel as being pro-nuclear. I'm not really pro-nuclear. I'm not pro or anti-nuclear, actually. I am pro-science and engineering, though. And why? It's not really because of a self-interest, the fact that I am a scientist, have been a scientist, I enjoy it. But actually, it's because I really believe, as I think the Conservative Party does actually, that science and innovation and our engineering strength is part of Britain's future. This has been part of what the current government has been expressing over the last 12 months, and I support it. I don't think that science and engineering on its own is our future, but it certainly plays a major role in it. We have many, assets as a country, including, many assets in the creative industries and other. But it's worth reiterating now just how exceptionally good the UK is in science and innovation and engineering. It really is an astonishing world leader. And so it seems right that we should take advantage of that leadership position. And I believe that it can deliver prosperity in a very broad sense for people in the UK, both in terms of their environment, their well-being, health, and high-value jobs, and access into high-value employment. So for me, the question of whether we should have a nuclear reactor in every town comes down to, it's an example of where I work in terms of working with government on how we can make sure that the UK has an environment in which these scientific and engineering endeavours can really thrive. Many of these points have been touched on already, but for me, just to illustrate them a bit more broadly, there are some pillars to this. One, certainly our education system, and making sure that young people are able to find a way to access into the sort of rich science and engineering assets and opportunities that there are around the country through various routes, whether they come from through different educational routes or come to it via apprenticeships or lifelong learning or routes in other parts of their lives. So looking at how we encourage people into science and engineering is really important, not only for their own opportunity, that they can choose to follow that path if they wish to, but also because these sectors, and I hope Rolls-Royce will back me up on this, they really need them actually, that we do have a shortage of skilled people in this area, and we have the capacity to be able to supply into that shortage if we address our education system to do so. A few other pillars, apart from this education one, would be our investment environment and our regulatory environment. It's absolutely essential for companies, either whether they're UK-based or looking to invest in the UK from abroad, that they see the long-term signals that the government is serious about backing science and innovation over generations and over multiple parliaments. And so it's really important that we see these signals from the centre of government, both in terms of its investment and also in terms of establishing the frameworks in which companies can reliably operate and make long-term plans, as I'm sure the companies in this room and on the panel will attest to, that the timelines for these kind of projects run into the decades. I think maybe I'll draw my comments to a close there, but I think I'm looking forward to the conversation. If you have questions that are specifically about nuclear reactors, then please don't ask me, because I'm not the one to answer them. But I think in terms of the public dialogue, which maybe be a final point, but actually the broader issues about how we can support endeavours like this and make the UK a leader in certain areas, such as nuclear, require this broader thinking of the pillars we need to underpin that over generations. And although I've talked about some levers that are under government's control there is also the public appetite for these kind of programs. And I think we've touched on it already, but actually you'll never get a nuclear reactor in every town unless you have sort of public support for an understanding of what benefits that brings both to the local community and to the nation as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, when I named this event, I had in mind what Harry was talking about public acceptability of nuclear power. And we did some polling in Cambridge University on how popular nuclear power is around the country. And there's this effect wherever you are, the closer you are to a nuclear power plant, the more pro-nuclear the population is, because they work with the people. Your father, your mother might work in the nuclear power plant. You'll talk to people about the issues and you'll understand them, whereas the people who are far removed from nuclear power might be a bit more in the dark about the issues. Just before I go to the audience, would either of you like to come back into anything Sarah said, or should we just open it out?
Just quickly for me, I agree with everything Sarah said, really, and I think it is part of the entire infrastructure. I agree. And Sarah touched on the pillars. I didn't really. I mean, the other thing we've been doing is aligning this very much to the 10 pillars from the industrial sector proposal, which the Nuclear Industry Association has submitted on behalf of its members. So it ties in with all those. And just to align that to successful sectors that we've got in the UK at the moment, we've got automotive and aerospace, and they very much succeed on the basis of this partnership with government in terms of long-term commitment, dual investment, and high skills and high investment in skills. And that's exactly what we want for the nuclear sector as well. I also, quickly agree with Tom as well. I don't want to at all undermine Hinkley Point C. I think it's hugely important for our nuclear renaissance in the UK, and SMRs are complementary to large reactors.
Okay, so we're going to open it out to the floor. We've got about half an hour for questions and answers. I'd like you to keep it short, and we want questions rather than long statements. And also, we've got roving mics, so please wait for the microphone and state your name and organisation. We'll start right at the front here.
Hi, it's Jessica Shankelman. I'm an energy journalist from Bloomberg News. I just wanted to ask about Brexit and how you think this programme that you're hoping to pursue could be influenced by Brexit, both in terms of an industrial strategy, but also if we leave the internal energy market, how does it affect the trading that Britain might be doing with its energy if it's building all these reactors in every town?
I think Tom has probably covered that quite extensively in recent months.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's an opportunity, potential opportunity in a world where we're outside of the European Union in terms of providing some of that impetus for some economic activity that is exportable. That's one of the attractive features potentially about SMRs. There are not, I don't want to suggest there are not going to be significant challenges with dealing with how we get from where we are now to the eventual outcome of that process, both in terms of specific nuclear things and Euratom, but also the wider issues you quite rightly touched on in terms of the energy market. But I think, we have to, I hope, try to influence and encourage government to deal with those things in a pragmatic and sensible way, so that we don't end up doing anything that damages the potential for this enterprise and various other things as well. I think that's doable. I think it will just be complicated to do, but I don't think it's impossible at all.
Harry, or Rolls-Royce particularly worried about Brexit? Their aircraft industry probably is. What about the nuclear side?
Not in this instance. I mean, there are several complicated issues that Tom's just mentioned. There are the Euratom ones. I think for the UK as well, it's in Euratom terms as well, it's things like the investment in column infusion and things of that nature in research and development that's done. So there are other issues that we need to be conscious of, not just our own. I tend to try and take a slightly more national perspective as well as a company one. But there are other complicated issues such as surveillance and regulation and safeguards and things of that nature. So it is quite complex. The actual capital markets, I think they normally find their own way of doing things. It'd be quite nice if we were putting some electricity back to Europe as opposed to taking quite so much. It'd be one thing I'd say.
And Sarah, I'm sure we could talk about science and engineering and Brexit all day long, so we won't go too much into this, but would you like to make any?
Yes, some brief comments. My organisation, Campaign for Science and Engineering, is on the Science Minister Joe Johnson's Forum for Science and Brexit, on which we talk about a number of the broader issues. I think if you see this question in the context of the fact that high R&D intensive companies, such as those that might be looking at nuclear, they really thrive on the ecosystem in the UK between our sort of academic excellence and our industry opportunity. So the implications of Brexit are those that impact directly on the company and on the work they wish to do, but they're also those that impact on our science base more broadly and on the ecosystem that exists of both output of talented and skilled people out of that and into industry, small and medium-sized businesses, the charity sector and large industry, as well as the venture capital and all of that sits together. So very briefly, there are some things that really are worth thinking through in terms of making sure we have the skilled people that come into that ecosystem with a migration policy that fits our ambitions for industrial strategy, and certainly the regulatory framework. And I think it's really worth emphasising that for us, through the process of Brexit and into a kind of new future for the UK, we really do need to consider quite carefully what we need to put in place to repatriate a regulatory framework that's going to operate in the UK and allow us to innovate ahead of the curve with the rest of the world going forward, rather than simply to follow on.
Thank you. I was going to, if we can have the mic here, I'll stay down this end to the gentleman in the second row, and then I'll open it to the wider audience.
Thank you very much. Nicholas McLean, if I could ask Sarah to deepen her answer slightly, in that training of homegrown skills is vital, but roughly how many years are we talking about? Is it 2 or 5 or longer? Because, and meanwhile, I totally agree with her that if our migration policy is too tight, we will be slowing down any positive possibilities for a nuclear renaissance, because we desperately need skills from abroad.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. I think there is a considerable lag time, as you say, in terms of growing homegrown talent. I think the skills needs, the talent pool for the scientific and innovative sector very broadly are probably mirrored in the nuclear industry, although I'd have to let you answer specifically for the nuclear industry. But very broadly, roughly about a quarter of the people that work in scientific industries do come from abroad, and then there's about a half and half split of whether they are from the EU or non-EU in very broad terms. And the people that come are of a very broad range of skills. So yes, you have your professor, your Regis professors, you have your kind of spin-out CEOs, but you have all the way down to the technician level as well. And if you look at the government's shortage occupation list, which is held by the Migration Advisory Committee, about 3/4 of the roles on that list are scientific and engineering in nature, and a number of them are actually specific to the nuclear industry. And they are not the highest qualified roles. Some of them are actually, relatively junior roles, but very specifically needed. So my position would be is that we need a migration policy that fits the ambitions of the country and the ambitions of us to be a scientific leading nation, an innovation nation. But that actually means that we need to encompass people right through the skill spectrum.
Would either of you like to comment on the skills and the nuclear industry's need for skills?
I can have a go first if you want. If we're talking about timeframes, I mean, typically when we take graduates into our nuclear sector business, it's about 10 years before they can attain an internal authority role, as an example on that side. if we're talking about taking, as we do as well, our apprentices in and taking them through to being team leaders in cells, then it's a good 5 years. So these are not short-term things that you need to do for committal. I mean, again, something we were talking about earlier was long-term commitment as part of the energy policy for a fleet, because what that does is it gives companies like ours the ability then to have that forecast, to be able to do that, to manage it and take them through. This does really give us an opportunity to do it. I firmly believe we can do this. I wouldn't want to do it just as UK nationals. I think there's got to be some proportion, because ultimately we will lose skills abroad as well, and I think it's quite natural and quite healthy to do so, to be honest. So I think it was something that I didn't mention before when I was asked. Certainly from a personal perspective, I'd certainly like for Brexit, the migration issue to be solved as soon as possible. I've got quite a lot of friends in the company who are Europeans who live here. I've got a lot of friends who are British who live in Europe.
I think just on that last point, the nuclear industry is and always has been international. It is a very international industry, and sometimes we think about that, or that's criticised in relation to where some of the technology comes from, or where some of the financing might come from for particular projects. But it works, equally the other way. There are lots of UK companies that are suppliers into international projects, and people move. And in the European context, one of the features of the Euratom is the very specific nuclear common market as part of the 4 things that Euratom essentially does. And that's why, in response to the earlier question, I made the point about how you approach that and being pragmatic and reasonable about it. So you don't want to... Everybody understands what the outcome of the referendum was, and also understands where the government is saying that they need to get to in the end point. Towards the end point. But you don't want to do that in a way that unreasonably damages lots of other things. And that's, I think, the point about doing this in the right way.
Thank you. So I had a question at the very back, standing up there, the gentleman.
Yes. I graduated in physics and computing. I'm very pleased to hear that we are moving on to small modular reactors, so that we do get you developed experience of producing regular reactor size. What I'm interested in is why we didn't consider liquid salt reactors. One of the, I think of solid fuel reactors, uranium rods, where you use 3% of the available electricity before you get internal gas poisoning of the nuclear reaction, as sort of coal approach 200 years ago. Solid fuel, you had to go with the ash, as against the liquid molten salt reactor, where you have a continuous process, you can continue to remove reactants and do the whole thing. And it is that area that thought up SMRs, and also because they're passively safe. They don't need lots and lots of additional safety equipment to cope with the passively unsafe high-pressure pressurized water reactor. Is there any likelihood of molten salt reactors being part of the SMR thinking process in the future?
No, I won't go to Sarah with that one. Tom?
The competition that the government started, when was it? Back in spring 20...
It was March 2016.
Was deliberately structured to encourage expressions of interest from a whole range of different interested parties, including a number of 4th generation, so molten salt and other reactor technologies. And so they are part of that competition and that process. So in answer to your question, are we considering it, and the government's considering it, well, they've had their pitches and the input from those. I mean, I suspect that the issue here is one around timing and availability. And it may be that the most appropriate way to pursue this is to have a twin-track strategy, which is to continue and to help to develop those what are largely at the moment theoretical designs into being worked up to see whether the potential is actually there, at the same time as continuing to encourage more readily available SMR technologies, of which there are a number. And I think that may well be the way in which, if I was in that position, you would want to try to do that, because you don't want to miss those opportunities, but you've also got to be cognizant of the fact they're not immediately available or soon to be available opportunities, but they may be in the future. Yeah.
Do you want me to comment a bit?
Sure.
we're not ignoring molten salt, and we're not ignoring future generation technologies at all. I think I said at the start that one of the issues we have, for the reasons that Tom said, is that particularly this generation we're talking about, and the timing of it is critical for the grid infrastructure. And actually that means it's got to be capital investable as well, because I'm not entirely sure the government would want to wholly fund the development of any small modular reactor. So therefore you go to commercially investable and risk, as we all know. But what this does give us, by choosing SMRs at this point, is to have a healthy industry that can actually do more than just track and, as laudable as it is to do science at universities, can also look at industrialisation in parallel as well, because what we'll have then is we'll have a vibrant sector that'll be able to do that.
Thank you. Could we lose a roving mic? Could we go to Edwina Curry at the front of this?
Thank you. Could I invite you to use your imagination a little? You're sitting here in Manchester. Nearly 200 years ago, there was an extraordinary breakthrough when the Stephensons put a power pack on a railway train. Now, what you've been talking about is all static stuff, and yet Rolls-Royce and Associates' expertise is in putting nuclear power packs into submarines.
Yep.
Are we likely to see some development like that? They'd be very small, but some development that actually puts some oomph into our train service or our lorries or our big ships, our container ships, or whatever in future.
So I know that at university, at Cambridge University, we did look into propulsion of ships, so freight ships, and that is one potential use of that. But again, it's public acceptability. So we have Rolls-Royce power their submarines, and that can you do civilian vehicles with that? Harry, is there any plans for people to do civilian freight and ships with nuclear reactors?
The only thing it's got to so far is on things like icebreakers or very complex vessels, and there's very good reasons for that. It's actually difficult to get economic viability. It's difficult to get international acceptance in terms of transportation, and it's very difficult as well for other issues which I don't really want to go into, which is inventory issues. So I think that, to be very clear, the SMRs we're talking about here are the low-enriched uranium oxide, so it's just standard nuclear fuel. We're not talking about the kind of military application things, and that actually does limit you significantly. That's why you can have size changes of such significance as well.
Yeah. They do use them for space travel. If you've seen the film The Martian, Matt Damon uses the plutonium left over from the ship to warm himself up as he travels. So we do use it for some interesting applications.
Can I just come in?
Sure.
Yeah, I have nothing to offer on the science of it, but I just think it's interesting when you think about that 200-year-old step change, that actually there was a big sort of public affairs campaign that went with it, and people weren't too keen on it initially, were they? It's like taking over from the horse, and ugly, ghastly machine. But I remember seeing some beautiful pictures of one of the first railway journeys, and they filled the carriages with people, and there's a long train of carriages and everyone waving and smiling. And I just think, what the answer that you've just heard has actually got a lot of public acceptability as an issue, and more or less everything you've just said. I didn't hear a lot that said actually technically it wasn't possible. I heard that was, one of them.
It's technically possible.
It's technically possible, and there's and the issue that you're talking about here is a hearts and minds one. So I think actually you can learn lessons from that 200-year-old approach, public affairs approach.
Sure.
Sorry, one more thing I should have added, and I should have said it right at the start. You're absolutely right. We're in Manchester and in the Midland Hotel just over there. Charles Rolls met Henry Royce on the 15th of May 1904. And if they hadn't, we wouldn't have Rolls-Royce.
Yeah, sorry, there's a gentleman in the glasses who's had just in the middle. Oh, no, sorry, sitting down. Yes, with your hand up. He's had my eye for a while.
Thank you. Just a question for David Orr. 2 points. You mentioned already license.
Sorry, what's your name?
Sorry, my name is Craig Leyland. I'm a councillor from Lincolnshire. I don't want to be too specific. I don't want to set hairs running. Already licensed sites and locations. Is there potential for others? And then the second part of the question is, because this is modular, there's obviously less of an implication for existing infrastructure. So these sites could potentially be more accessible in locations that you wouldn't necessarily put a large structure. Thank you.
Yep, certainly. I should have been very clear. The intent on using licensed sites is quite appropriate. We have to be a bit careful here. They can't just go anywhere. I mean, these do require quite a lot of secondary cooling water. So although they can go inland, you're actually talking more on what you call benign large rivers. So it'd be rivers potentially like the Trent or the Ouse, for example. So there are possibilities there where large coal stations are at the moment. And that is an option perhaps on brownfield sites in the future. So, but that's not at all policy yet. It's just entirely feasible should we wish to do that as a country in the future. The existing infrastructure question, again, I was remiss with when I started off. What I should have said, that every component that we've designed, the limiting factor of both our power and our station has been that we have everything transportable by a standard Arctic lorry or rail truck. So the answer is yes, there's nothing in terms of restrictions on that basis, but the restrictions are much more by the environmental and the cooling water.
Sure. Just, I mean, on that point about siting and licensed sites, there are a number of sites that are existingly nuclear licensed sites, so which could be potentially useful for SMRs. There are sites that weren't approved in the site process for large-scale reactors that are potentially available, and of course, one of those advantages is about that being able to use that existing infrastructure. Because when you're thinking about this in the context of being able to do this in as affordable way as possible, then having some of the grid infrastructure there already that you can use and build up over time is another important point of that. And that's, when Greg Clark talks about upgrading infrastructure, this is one way where you can upgrade from a high carbon to low carbon source of power. I should just in relation to the point that Edwina was making before, that obviously everybody in this conference is going to want to be in every aspect of every part of the conference, but just in case you felt like you wanted an hour off at some point, go to the Manchester Science and Technology Museum, because you'll see there the whole history of this and the story of everything that you talked about, and it is absolutely fascinating. Every now and then it's worth reminding ourselves of that history and that ability and that industrial intelligence and commitment and imagination, and trying to apply that to the world we're in now.
Sure. I used to work at the Rutherford Appleton Lab, which is also famous for Manchester related. So there's a lady in purple there in the middle, if you could get the mic to her.
Hello, thanks. Hi, Catherine Fletcher. I'm from 7 generations of the Manchester Science and Technology, but today I'm with the Cheshire and Wirral area. A question for David. We're fortunate to have Rolls-Royce as part of our industrial base in the country. You're a truly global firm, and we recognise that actually there will be a competitive and global process to actually manufacture SMRs. I'd be interested to hear from you what we need to be doing on this side of the fence to keep that as much as possible in the UK, to provide the jobs for the people that are going to come out of the universities or apprenticeships, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I think for me, I alluded to it earlier, which was the success that we've had in the aerospace and automotive sectors. So I don't think it's doing anything particularly new. I'd hope we'd have to do more of it. So we'd have to do everything that was talked about earlier about STEM and about encouraging. And we do, as you probably well know, Catherine, we actually go into universities and develop courses along with you, which I'd heard that was an innovation from one of the fringe groups I've been to this morning, which was interesting because we do it already. But we'd be able to put more volume on that. I don't see an issue with the people we have today. In fact, they're far brighter than I ever was when I left college and stuff. So no issues at all with that. So it's getting the numbers in. I mean, the beauty as well with nuclear, of course, is that we need lots of physicists, lots of material scientists and chemists. And for some reason, we've got to get over this thing about attracting ladies into engineering. I don't know what it is. But there seems to be some block there, and that's something we really must get over. That is not simply true in materials, physics and chemistry. We can attract them. and we get very good ratios. I think we attract on ratios for ladies about double the amount that go into engineering degrees across the country on average, which is great for us, but it's still not enough, and that's what we require. So we require more, but we require it to be broader as well. I think the actual infrastructure is very good in the UK and it's in place. I think if we do all the things like that, we do catapults, we do sharing in growth as they do in the other sectors, and we look at it, like we were saying, as a fleet, because every managing director of our supply chain in our group always says to us, "Nice words, David, but where's the order book?" Because as soon as they've got an order book, they will invest.
We have a gentleman at the very front here. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Reactor.
I think if you just keep talk, it'll pick it up.
Altrincham Sail West, once of Calder Hall. Can you give us an indication of how long it will take to install these reactors from signing the contract to on power? Bearing in mind in this country, long-term planning is the next general election.
Thank you. David, I think you take that one.
Currently what we're looking at is for the first of a kind. In order to get one on the grid by 2030, we're after a form of commitment by the end of this year. So I'm not saying that has to be total commitment, but the government do know what I mean by commitment. So they've asked us what assumptions would be appropriate for committal for going further, and those we've explained. We're looking at the major time frames, which you well know as being an ex-person at Calder Hall, like 1956, wow, when it started there, wasn't it? Anyway, we're talking about 4.5 years for the licensing process. Now again, we've already started talking with the regulator, and we're going to work together on that and try and reduce that time frame. And then in typical form, you're looking about 7 years for the actual work on site to install the nuclear power station for a first of a kind. So in total, we're looking at 12 years. So that's why I'm saying from the end of this year. When we're looking to start on the learner curve and with the factory learning, we're trying to reduce that 7 years on site down to 4 years. That's the target. Our actual target is, we have very ambitious targets. Our target's 500 days on site eventually, but what we want to get to is certainly to 4 years. In a first of a kind, I'll say it politely, things always happen. So it actually just gives you that risk period for getting your first of a kind on site. Those are the type of big time frames. In parallel, the other big area as well is the supply chain capability. And again, it's quite short time frames for that. I mean, we need to start committing to plans for the major facilities in the middle of 2019.
Tom, sorry, I'd just like to ask about something I've wondered. What is the capability of the Office for Nuclear Regulation in doing generic design assessments? Can they do multiple in parallel? What's their capacity like?
Well, they have been doing, so potentially they could again. I mean, I think there are other issues that the ONR has to deal with. For example, the ONR will be taking on safeguarding responsibilities from Euratom relatively soon, on the assumption that the Nuclear Safeguards Bill gets passed through Parliament. So there will be, a range of things that ONR has to deal with at the same time. And so, the capability and the capacity of the ONR is an important part of this. That's part of the, when we think about this in terms of either a sector deal or discussion with government, the government's not about saying this is the technology. The government's about ensuring that there is the capacity to be able to go through a GDA, that the GDA is the appropriate time for ensuring that that the assessment meets all of the requirements in terms of safety, security, and all the other aspects of getting that assessment done, that the sites are available. Those are the things which are effectively in the remit and the ambit of the government as part of this, and that could have a significant impact on that timescale that David talked about, because if that's done correctly and you've got the right capacity to be able to do that, you can really get these things moving reasonably quickly.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. Sorry. Sorry.
Ian Walker from Sheffield Conservatives, and also my company is a member of the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in Sheffield. Two questions of clarification from David, if I may. One, I think you mentioned that you're looking for a total of 40 gigawatts in total nuclear, is that right? A third of the...
40 gigawatts electric by 2050. The country should be, yeah. If
Which
it's
is
a
like
third.
So we're at 40 gigawatts total at the moment, so that's a 3 times increase in total requirement. Is that what you're saying?
It's yes, that's right.
Okay,
yeah,
fine.
yeah.
And the other question is, I think you mentioned the station's up to about 400 megawatts, 440 megawatts, something like that for the package stations.
Our one at the moment is at 440 megawatts electric.
How much of a step up for you at Rolls-Royce is that? You're the only UK manufacturer of reactors at the moment. How much of a technical risk is that from the size you're making at the moment?
It isn't particularly, because if you go back to that, I said the power is actually limited by the transportation requirements. I mean, just so you know, the largest vessel, the RPV, is obviously without the head and the CRDMs on top at that time, but it's 4.5 metres by just over 11 metres, and it's in the order of 270 tonnes, so it's not something in size terms that we're not used to managing with. And I know you remember, I'm currently the chair of the NAMRC programme board, so yeah, nice to see you.
I think I'll have to wrap it up there. Our events team have a full few days of events, and we have another event in half an hour in this room called Putting Power in the Northern Powerhouse. I'd like to thank Rolls-Royce again for their sponsorship of the event. And sorry, just Sarah has a burning comment very quickly.
I do have a burning comment. It's very quick. We talked about gender and getting girls into science subjects. Let me leave you with this thought. 9% of the workforce in science and engineering roles, if you discount medicine, 9% are female. And that has really got to change. And at A-level, at GCSE, girls outperform boys in most subjects. They do in physics and maths, as in many subjects. But the number of girls choosing to take computing and physics at A-level, you just can't make this stuff up if you guess. So 95% of candidates for computing are boys and 5% are girls. And for physics, it's 20% are girls and 80% are boys. And that has to be addressed. Exactly. Yes. And I mean, I was just checking my graphs from our last analysis, and I can tell you the graphs are completely flat for the data that we have. And you need these people.
We do.
We've talked about the education system and the immigration system to get people in. Well, you really got to start encouraging that whole population into these subjects.
Thank you very much. Well said. Please pick up a leaflet and look at Policy Exchange events, and thank the panel